Joseph had to have shown some business leadership skills. Probably got that from his dad. Now you're sold as a slave. And when Potiphar bought him, he's just buying a slave. Right? And just like, as I imagine the slaves down on the plantations, the slaves that showed some ambition and wanted to improve themselves, you know, they would get to go work in the master's house as cooks, maids, whatever, and all the other slaves would call him Uncle Tom, it seems like. Because they showed some initiative, because they had some skills, some talent. Well, if you had someone like that working in your place, you would probably latch a hold of them and use their skills. It makes sense, right? So, if God wants to make Joseph second in charge of Egypt, how does he do that? Well, first he has to develop those skills in Joseph, so you do it in a household. Okay. Then from there, he's developed as much as he could there in that small size. So then he gets thrown in jail, you know, and he sits there, and over the next 15 years or whatever it is, he becomes the person running the jail. You know, not my idea. I mean, it's kind of comical the way how God did it. But he developed those skills.
He had a purpose.
Yeah, God had a purpose. And then finally, he winds up second in charge. But it was interesting to me just thinking about it, how God developed those skills, and he gave them, you know, first with Joseph in his family, because the other boys were being taught how to be shepherds. Joseph had to have been being taught how to run a business by his dad, you know. Anyway, so that was one of my thoughts. Then I came across one commentary that kind of put out this concept in making a comparison between Pharaoh and Jesus. Okay. Pharaoh, he was a man, but he was also considered a god. And Jesus is a man god. You know, the Pharaoh was also, in a way, similar to a high priest. He didn't do so much, I don't think, religiously, but he was the go-between between God and regular man.
Are pharaohs like, what is, like the pharaoh that they had here, and then the pharaoh that was in Exodus, is like, that's not like one person, that's like the leader.
That's the leader, president.
It's not, because they don't ever give them a name.
They could, but yeah.
They're just,
The
okay.
pharaohs all had names, but generally we just referred to them as president.
Okay.
If I said president, you'd know I'm talking about
Yeah.
that guy that doesn't remember things.
Yeah.
What's his name?
He was the guy sitting over there last.
Okay, that was, okay.
Yeah. So the other similarity was that the Pharaoh would go between the God and the people. And Jesus did the same thing. He does that as a high priest. So the guy was making a little comparison there, and I said, okay, that's an interesting thought. So we go now to 46, chapter 1.
You mean chapter 46.
Chapter 46, verse 1. Okay. And we see, so Israel set out with all that was his, and when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to God of his father Isaac. The only thing I'm going to say about Beersheba it's the only place, apparently, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all stopped and worshiped God. They worshiped God in many places, but it's interesting that this is the one place the Bible says they all three went sometime during their life and worshiped God.
Well, I looked at a map today, in my other Bible, and this town or place is real far from Jerusalem, and it's really close to Egypt. So they couldn't miss it if they were going to Egypt.
It's probably, yeah, you're right, it's probably on the road down to Egypt,
Yeah,
or out coming back from Egypt, because Abraham did it on his way back.
right.
So 2, and God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Joseph had visions. I'm not so familiar with Jacob having visions. I think in the past, God just spoke to Jacob.
Didn't Jacob have visions,
no.
where the angels came down?
Is that Jacob?
Was it either,
Somebody slept on a rock.
Yeah.
and somebody wrestled with him and hurt his, hip? That's not Jacob?
Must be Jacob.
Yeah.
I'm out. I think of, when I think of the 3 of them who had visions, I think of Joseph. You know, he told his brothers, you're gonna bow down and worship me sometime. And he told his dad, oh, by the way, Dad, you're gonna bow down and worship me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think of Joseph, I don't, you know. So anyways, so Jacob is having another vision. Here I am, he replied. 3, I am God, the God of your father, he said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. Why would he say, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt?
I don't know, the Egyptians didn't like the Jews.
Well, I don't know if I'd say that so much. They didn't like shepherds. He was a shepherd. Abraham and Sarah went down to Egypt because of a famine. And that didn't turn out that, well, it actually turned out really good for them financially because the Pharaoh gave them all sorts of stuff. But that was when Sarah said, yeah, Jacob's just my brother, or Abraham is just my brother. You know, and then the Pharaoh said, no. You guys are more than just husband and wife. I mean, you guys are more like husband and wife. And he gave them all sorts of, riches. So I think to a certain extent, the family might have been hesitant to go back to Egypt. But he also, Jacob was good at waiting on God to tell him where to go. You know, he took his mom's directions of leave and go to my brother Laban. And then on the way back, God would tell him, head on back to the promised land. So he hadn't been told to go to Egypt, so maybe that was part of it, and now he's being told to go to Egypt. For I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. If you're an old man, you just found out that your son, that you thought had died, is going to be the person who closes your eyes. How would you feel on that?
Well, I feel that you missed a part of that verse when it says, you will die in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that's an important part?
because it's always nice to know when you're gonna die.
Okay. And, you know, that might be comforting knowing that I'm going down to Egypt. I'm gonna be with my son.
The one you thought was dead.
And I'm gonna die there, which probably later in a couple of chapters, he makes, Joseph promise to take him to the promised land, his remains, bury him there. You know, so that was probably, yeah, you're right, probably part of that whole thought process. In fact, if we actually even went as far back to Abraham, when he was telling Abraham, there was that one line in there where it said, you'll go to a country, or maybe it even said Egypt, where you'll be strangers for 400 years, and then you'll come back to the promised land. In hindsight, we can take a look at something like that and say, okay, so God's gonna keep them in Egypt for 400 years. You know, we can see that that prediction was made, that it came true. If Jacob would have known that, if he would have recalled that, I mean, we have the benefit of having the Bible to make that connection. They had, you know, the oral history that was handed down. And sometimes those oral histories work really good. John, when you were a little kid, did you hear any stories over and over and over again from Grandma and Grandpa or from Mom and Dad telling you about things?
I don't remember.
I vaguely remember Grandma and Grandpa talking about living in Austria. Grandpa lived in a little city in Austria that was on the border. And depending on who ruled that little city, he sometimes was a German citizen. You know, ancestors were German and some were Austrians, and then they'd go back to German. And during World War II, that city was controlled by Germany, and so, well, at World War I. So when great grandma and grandpa came over here, they were technically Germans instead of Austrians. And they would go back and forth and argue, well, technically we are 3/4 Germans and 1/4 Austrian, because your city really was.
That's how it was at Alsace-Lorraine in France.
Oh,
It
yeah.
belongs to France now, but it was German, and my folks came from there. And they came and said they were German, but when they did the census, they told the census person they were from that region, they put them down as French, but they were really German.
Okay.
Oh, it's interesting.
A lot of interesting things happened in Ellis Island, depending on who you got to speak to and if they understood what you had to say. My friend Frank Petrovsky came over, and Petrovsky was given a whole new spelling. The guy didn't know how to spell it in Polish, didn't understand, and so he just came up with the new American version. But so those are, you know, some of the oral traditions that we hear, that we remember. That's why when they say, well, how do we know what Adam had to say, or Eve, you know? Well, you hear those traditions, especially when they live for 1,000 years. You hear it over 700 years, you have the chance to go talk to them, you can interrogate them. You can really get the story, you remember it. But, so we're on verse 5. Then Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's sons took their father Jacob and their children and their wives in the carts that Pharaoh had sent to transport him. So Jacob and all his offsprings went to Egypt, taking with them their livestock and their possessions they had acquired in Canaan. Jacob brought with him to Egypt his sons, his grandsons, his daughters, his granddaughters, all his offspring.
So did they take all their sheep too, cause it says they took their livestock?
Yep. Now, do you guys want to go through all of these names in
No.
verses
No.
8 through
No.
13?
Waiting to hear him pronounce it.
Actually, it's 8 through,
25.
well, the only thing that I really wanted to bring out in this, if we look at verse 22, it's really 21 and 22. The sons of Benjamin, now it would be actually verse 19. The sons of Jacob's wife, Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. In Egypt, Manasseh and Ephraim were born to Joseph. Okay, so then we go down, we see Benjamin's kids in verse 21, he has like 10 of them.
Yeah.
You know, we think of Benjamin as being young, but he's old enough to have kids and he has 10 of them. So then it goes 22. These were the sons of Rachel who were born to Jacob, 14 in all.
But it only lists 12. Oh, I guess they're talking Jacob and
And Benjamin.
Joseph and Benjamin, so that's how they get 14. Okay.
Yeah. So I just wanted to point that out. It's that concept of seed, you know, your descendants. When I talk about always back in Genesis 3:16, when God is talking to Satan and he says there'll be enmity between your seed and her seed. That word seed is the same, I believe, as being used here, and it's talking about descendants. Outside of that, then we can move on.
Can I just say something?
Sure.
I think that's amazing because even nowadays, we have, in big families, some are named the same. There's Robert and William and Robert. All these 70, I was just glancing through, and none of them, they're all different names. How can you come up with all these names? It's gotta be a job in itself.
These are all common names.
I know. 70, that's a lot of them. And that-
So I think we're on verse 26, we can jump in. All those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants, not counting his sons' wives, numbered 66 persons, with 2 sons who had been born to Joseph in Egypt. The members of Jacob's family, which went to Egypt, were 70 in all. 28. Now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions to Goshen. Why is that important that he sent Judah?
Because Judah kind of took over the leadership, because Reuben, being dishonest, dishonest.
Yeah. So already here we can see that Reuben lost leadership within the family. We can see that the next two, I forget who they were now. Doesn't make anything. But we can see that Judah, the 4th son, becomes the leader of the family. Being trained to be the leader, or at least it's being pointed out here that.
Is Judah, from Judah's line, did Jesus come?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions to Goshen. When they arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariots made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Chris, how long is a long time? We stumped the teacher.
Oh,
Israel said to Joseph, notice Israel, not Jacob.
He's a 4th son.
Judah's the 4th son.
Jacob.
things it's like way back. Cause
Yeah.
I've looked for it a couple times, the list of the kids.
Yep, you're going to go back.
Oh, chapter 31 is where mine is.
Yeah,
Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah.
yeah.
What did he used to do?
He's not. Bishop.
Also,
Really?
verse 29, I mean, chapter 29. Jacob's children starts
It's on
with,
there earlier.
but anyway. Uh, 31, then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and speak to Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who are living in the land of Canaan have come to me. These men are shepherds. Okay, basically this is just repeating what happened in 45.
Well, I don't remember what happened in 45, because that was 4 weeks ago.
In 45.
That was last year.
Yeah. In 45, it's basically Joseph introduces himself to his brothers. Pharaoh hears that he was crying. He says, my family is, Pharaoh says, well, send the carts and everything. And end of 45, his father realizes that all of this is true and it's not a dream. Yeah. So now they're coming back. Yeah. Then Joseph said to his brothers, that's where Pharaoh said if they can live in Goshen. And he says, my brothers and my father's household who are living in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds. They tend livestock. And they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. When Pharaoh calls you and asks, what is your occupation? You should answer, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, from all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians.
I remember my Exodus question, can I ask it?
Sure.
I thought the Canaanites were bad people.
Canaanites weren't good people.
So why is the promised land Canaan? Because it was a good land?
The land was good.
The land
It
was
was
good.
milk and honey.
Right, I read that.
Yeah. So the land produced a
land-
lot of.
The land was good. That's
But the
why
people
that was
that
going to be
lived
the
in
promised land, but the people that lived there were not good. Okay.
When
Alright.
people who lived there were pagans, and they worshiped idols and all, and when Moses went back to give them the land, God told him to kill everybody, and he didn't. Because he wanted them out of there because if they were idol worshippers.
Idol worshippers.
Idol.
By not killing them,
Huh?
by not killing off everybody,
They would
eventually
integrate
they.
with the Israel people, yeah.
And see, that was what was so interesting, really, up until this point, and it hasn't, I mean, we haven't really talked about it. But Abraham got his wife, his sister, the family has stayed separate. They haven't intermingled with the Canaanites, or like with Ishmael, he went out, got a wife from Egypt.
Right.
Esau married Canaanites, and they became the Edomites, but they weren't part of it. They were, outside of this group of people that God's protecting. And this group of people now God takes down to Egypt, and he says, you guys are shepherds. Egyptians hate shepherds. So you're going to live out in this nice community out there where the shepherds are, and you're not going to get to intermingle with the Egyptians because they aren't going to like you.
So is Goshen a different place?
Goshen, if you think about Egypt and the Nile River, the Nile River is the longest river in the world at 4,000 miles, and it runs into the Mediterranean Sea. And so, on the south side, you have Sudan, and then you have Egypt. And a month ago, I brought this up. In Egypt, you had, the pharaohs were different nationalities at different times on who was ruling. So at one point, you had the black-skinned Southern Africans that were the pharaohs. At a different time, you had Arabs that came over and ran that were pharaohs. Well, eventually,
So
you
is
have the
Pharaoh,
Ro-
is Pharaoh considered the president of Egypt?
Yes.
Okay, Egypt.
Eventually, you had the Romans and the Greeks that came down.
Yeah, because the last pharaohs were Greek.
Right. And so I remember making a comment that, in the end of chapter 50, or an introduction into Exodus, there's a phrase in there where the Pharaoh did not remember Joseph,
Joseph, yeah.
you know, and it's showing you that there was a change in leadership. A whole different, it was like Egypt got taken over, and they didn't know the history of Joseph. They didn't understand why these Jews were out there, and so the Jews became slaves, and eventually they, you know. Egypt, with the Nile River, even with this famine, what was so unique was that you had the Nile River would flood, just like the Euphrates River and the Tigris River, and that flooded water would bring good soil for good crops,
Like the Mississippi,
like the Mississippi River.
yeah.
Yeah. So if you have a drought, you're not getting that good fertile soil, so you're not gonna get good crops. You know, so when they go back in history and they try to see who was the pharaoh and all, there are things that they can take a look at and line up. But written history back then wasn't as good as it is today. I mean, back then it was oral history, a lot more oral history. But, we'll see that famine comes into play in chapter 40, I think it's 48.
So Goshen is part of Egypt?
Goshen is part of Egypt. It's the part that goes up by the Mediterranean.
Like next to the Sinai Peninsula?
Yes.
Okay.
So. That's where you start. If you get into Egyptian history and stuff, and you take a look at where the pyramids were built and the Valley of the Kings and stuff. The Valley of the Kings was much farther south, like the southern border of Egypt and Sudan. The pyramids were further north, you know. So it's interesting, because even with the pyramids, they say the pyramids were built for what?
They claim it's tombs, but they couldn't find any.
There's never found any tombs. And if they were tombs, then why did you have the Valley of the Kings with all the burial sites there from the same time period? Older time period, newer time period, you know? So those pyramids being built, I'm not so sure were tombs. You know, they may have just been,
Well, there's a lot of speculation on with those pyramids, or if you look at all that ancient alien stuff on television.
I did hear one that I thought, one fact that I heard was quite interesting. If you measure the bottom of the Great Pyramid and you do geometry mathematics, based on the four bottom lengths times the four angles going to the top, you come out with basically the size of the earth. The mass of the size of the earth, which I found interesting. And it fits in with, it starts fitting in with that astronomy. Trying to replicate stuff up in the sky and on Earth, and now you have something that's coming out similar in mass of the Earth, and so maybe it does have more to do with that strange stuff. I think we have to remember that an awful lot of knowledge before the flood was lost. And a lot of knowledge back then in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, even over in China, the Aztec, the Mayans, all of these civilizations, we lost.
We also
99.
lost when, the great, what's that young guy that died? And he burned a library in Egypt, in Alexandria.
Oh, yeah, I remember, but wasn't that Alexander the Great, one of
Yeah,
them?
I just couldn't think of his name. Yeah,
Well, that was the same thing with the Mayans, that the Spaniards got over there, and they burnt their books, so we lost all their history. They burnt so much stuff that it was 3 years of everyday fires. So we lost an awful lot of this ancient knowledge.
yeah, right.
And a lot of it had to do with the stars and the interconnections. But anyways, off topic. Right, Chris? Okay, so 47. Okay, Joseph just got done telling his brothers, when I present you to Pharaoh, you're to say you're shepherds. 47 starts off now with them being presented to Pharaoh. So it's basically a repeat. Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my father and brothers with their flocks and herds and everything they own have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen. He chose five of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked his brothers, what is your occupation? Your servants are shepherds, they replied to Pharaoh, just as our fathers were. They also said to him, we have come to live here for a while, because the famine is severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now please let your servants settle in Goshen. Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them with special abilities, put them in charge of my own flock. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? Okay, does anyone else have a different version for verse 8?
No.
How old are you?
Or
Pharaoh asked him.
after Jacob blessed him? Does anyone have anything different? Okay, some translations will say more or less, Jacob greeted Pharaoh. Okay, when we see that word blessed and we talk about, I'm going to bless Sue, I'm going to put a special blessing on Sue, well, that can also be a greeting, a hello, a welcome.
But to me, that's totally two different things
It is in our
in our
culture,
culture.
but at this time, this probably would, or you might give them a blessing of a very generic blessing. What I'm trying to bring out here is this was not a specific blessing like when he blessed his kids. Okay?
No, he could have just said to Pharaoh, I bless you for letting us stay here in Goshen,
Right.
you know?
So anyways, how old are you? Verse 9, Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage. Anyone else have a different word? The years of my pilgrimage.
I have traveled this earth.
That's what I've got.
The years
Wait, where are we?
of traveling my
Number
earth.
9, verse 9.
Verse 9, okay.
So can you read verse 9 for me?
Jacob replied, I have traveled this earth for 130 hard years.
Okay. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my father. I don't know if yours says the same
It
thing.
says, but my life has been short compared to the lives of my ancestors.
Okay. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out of his presence.
You know, I was thinking down south, a lot of people say, if you do something for them, they'll say bless you. So I think that's probably what this was.
Don't they say that if you sneeze too?
I was just,
Yeah,
that just
good
popped in my
bless.
head, yeah.
Yeah.
You know. So, in my Bible, it uses the word pilgrimage. And the only reason why that kind of sticks out in my head is because I think about how we're supposed to be pilgrims here on earth. Verse 11, so Joseph settled his father and brothers in Egypt and gave them property at the best part of the land, the district of Ramses.
Ramses.
So this would imply one of two things. Either Pharaoh Ramses was already a pharaoh at this time, and that land was known as Ramses' land. Okay? Or it could mean that 600 years later, Ramses' land, and that was the land that the Israelites lived on before they left. It could be either one.
What would you want on Ramses?
Well, there were more. There's Ramses 1, 2, and 3.
4 or 5.
Yeah. But the reason why I bring that out is because people have tried to use that distinction, the land of Ramses, to date, to try to match up the two calendars on when the Jews were slaves in Egypt. Because the timelines don't really match up that great. The calendars.
The two calendars.
The Egyptian calendar, when they say that the Egyptians were here, if you listen to modern day archaeologists for Egypt,
Oh, okay.
versus Israeli archaeologists
Oh, okay.
trying to match this timeline. If you don't want to believe in Yahweh, you don't want, and you're in Egypt, you don't want to use the Israelite calendar. If you don't want
Are you talking-
modern day science,
Are you talking now?
yeah.
Well, what calendar do we use? I thought it was called Julian or
For
something.
the Julian calendar. But archaeologists who sit there and try to put all the timelines together, it depends on, there's still personal preference comes into play.
So the,
For example, an evolutionist will say the world is 4.5 billion years old, the universe is 15.5 or whatever. And as a creationist will say, no, the world's about 10,000 years old when God created. Well, which one do you believe is the personal preference? So now you have the Egyptians with their timeline that sit there and say, we want to put Israel in a timeline that doesn't really match up with what the Bible says. And then they say, see, the Bible is wrong because it doesn't match up our timeline.
Okay.
Long way for me to say, should any of you have went there? Should I have, John? Okay. So we're on verse 12. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers. This is an interesting point. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their children. Why talking about Joseph providing them with food is important?
Well, there's still a famine, aren't there?
They're
Because
in
there
the
was a
famine.
famine and Joseph was in charge of the food.
And we're about to see Joseph leading Egypt during the famine in verse 13. How far can we go in 5 minutes, guys? Should we start that next section or not?
No.
Okay.
Okay, she has to bring the treats next time.
I will, if I'm allowed to, so if I'm not allowed to, so I will.
So we will start on verse 13 of chapter 47 next time.
Yeah, verse 13.
I got it down.
She has it down.
Which one of you is working tonight?
Neither. We both have off this week.
They
Oh,
they overworked you too
I'm
much.
working tomorrow.
Oh. She's working tomorrow. She does double duty. Did everyone have a nice Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's?
It's okay.
It's all right, it was there. I did what I normally do, laundry and clean, so it's.
It was weird to have it on a Saturday.
I know, because we missed 2 weeks of church.
Yeah.
So how was
Well, I
Arizona?
thought it was weird, I had to go on Friday and then Saturday